Catherine Parr's life unfolded like a dramatic tapestry, woven with threads of resilience, intellect, and unwavering determination. As the last wife of the infamous Henry VIII, she could have easily been lost to the shadows of history, overshadowed by her royal predecessors and their tumultuous legacies. Yet, Catherine was far more than just the sixth wife in a series of royal marriages. She was a survivor in the truest sense, a woman who faced the most perilous of circumstances and emerged not only unscathed but empowered. Her story is one of triumph over adversity, a journey through love, loss, faith, and power that would leave an indelible mark on the history of England. In the early 16th century, England was a kingdom on the cusp of dramatic transformation. The reign of Henry VIII, who ascended the throne in 1509, would forever alter the religious, political, and social fabric of the nation. England was still a Catholic country at the start of the century, deeply tied to the authority of the Pope in Rome, and steeped in medieval traditions. Yet beneath the surface, winds of change were beginning to blow. The Renaissance had already spread across Europe, inspiring new ways of thinking about art, science, and governance. At the same time, the early murmurs of religious reform were beginning to stir, and England, though initially resistant, would not remain untouched for long. Against this backdrop, Henry VIII's marriages became more than just personal affairs. They were pivotal political and religious events that shaped the destiny of the entire kingdom. Each marriage reflected and fueled the king's broader ambitions, frustrations, and insecurities. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon set the stage for a confrontation with the Catholic Church when his desire for a male heir, and his infatuation with Anne Boleyn, led to his historic break from Rome. Subsequent marriages revealed a pattern of personal passion intertwined with political calculation. The fates of his wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, captured the imagination of generations and came to symbolize the perils of royal intimacy in a volatile court. Henry's obsession with securing a male heir to solidify his dynasty drove many of his decisions, but his marriages also became conduits through which broader societal shifts were expressed. They reflected changing attitudes toward female authority, religious identity, and the limits of monarchical power. They demonstrated how personal desires and political necessity often collided, with devastating consequences for those involved. Every woman who married Henry did so at her own peril, and each brought her own distinct character and influence to the shifting sands of Tudor England. It is within this complex and dangerous world that Catherine Parr's story emerges, a story often overshadowed by the more scandalous tales of her predecessors yet no less significant. Unlike Henry's earlier wives, Catherine did not come to Henry young, naive, or powerless. She had already experienced life as a wife and a widow twice over. She understood loss, survival, and the careful navigation of dangerous political currents. Her marriage to Henry was not born from youthful ambition or the dazzling beauty that had entranced the king in his earlier years. Instead, Catherine's appeal lay in her wisdom, composure, and intelligence, qualities Henry, aging, ailing, and increasingly paranoid, came to value highly. Catherine Parr's story matters because she was not merely the woman who outlived Henry VIII. She was an active participant in the political and religious upheavals of her time. As queen, she exercised influence with care and shrewdness, working behind the scenes to promote reconciliation among Henry's estranged children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and helping to secure their places in the line of succession. Her efforts would have far-reaching consequences, ultimately leading to the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and the iconic Elizabeth I. Through her personal relationships with these future monarchs, Catherine Parr helped to shape the next generation of English rulers. Moreover, Catherine's contributions to the English Reformation cannot be overstated. She was an ardent supporter of the new faith, advocating for the spread of Protestant ideas at a time when doing so was dangerous, even treasonous. She surrounded herself with reform-minded scholars and promoted the translation of religious texts into English. Her own writings, including prayers or meditations and the Lamentation of a Sinner, were not only significant theological contributions but also remarkable milestones for women's authorship in England. Catherine became the first English queen to publish a book under her own name, breaking barriers in a society that often silenced women's voices. Catherine Parr's survival is, in itself, a testament to her extraordinary resilience and political acumen. She came perilously close to downfall when conservative factions at court, alarmed by her Protestant sympathies, sought to bring charges of heresy against her. A warrant for her arrest was reportedly drawn up, and the Queen found herself walking a perilous tightrope. Through humility, quick thinking, and a masterful display of submission, she managed to pacify Henry's wrath and preserve her position, and her life. It is a telling episode that illustrates Catherine's profound understanding of court dynamics and her ability to adapt under immense pressure. Yet her survival was not merely a matter of personal triumph. It symbolized the enduring strength of women navigating a world designed to render them powerless. In an age when a queen could be discarded or destroyed at a monarch's whim, Catherine Parr managed not only to survive but to exert influence, to publish, to govern, and to advocate for religious reform. Her life stands as a counterpoint to the narrative of victimhood so often associated with Henry's wives. Where others fell, Catherine endured, and in enduring, she changed the course of English history. This exploration of Catherine Parr's life is not simply an account of a woman who happened to outlive a king. It is an examination of a queen who rose above the dangers and limitations of her time, who carved out a space for herself in a treacherous court, and who contributed meaningfully to the political and spiritual evolution of her nation. Her journey from noble daughter to twice-widowed gentlewoman, to queen consort, regent, author, and ultimately reformer, offers a compelling portrait of a woman of immense courage and vision. In understanding Catherine Parr, we gain a deeper insight into the complexities of Tudor England and the profound impact an individual could have within a rigid and often unforgiving system. Her story invites us to reconsider assumptions about female power, survival, and influence in a period where women's roles were ostensibly limited. It challenges us to see beyond the familiar trope of Henry's 6 wives, and to appreciate the unique contributions of each, especially Catherine, whose quiet strength helped to shape a nation on the brink of modernity. Catherine Parr is far more than the final wife of Henry VIII. She is a figure who demands recognition as a queen who ruled wisely in the king's absence, an intellectual who championed religious reform, an author who dared to publish her thoughts, and a survivor whose resilience left an indelible mark on English history. Her life, rich in complexity and courage, deserves to be told not as a footnote to Henry's story but as a vital and compelling narrative in its own right. Catherine Parr, born in 1512, entered a world deeply entrenched in lineage, loyalty, and legacy. From the very start, she carried the weight of noble blood in her veins. Her ancestry linked her not only to prominent English families but to the very heart of courtly life. The Parr family, with its rich heritage, traced its roots to northern English nobility. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal, was a knight of considerable repute and an influential courtier during the reign of Henry VIII. Her mother, Maud Green, belonged to a well-established family and was herself a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Through both her paternal and maternal lines, Catherine Parr was deeply intertwined with the currents of power and privilege that defined English aristocratic society. The early 16th century was a time when connections to the royal court could determine the fate of entire families. Catherine's lineage ensured that she was born into an environment steeped in the language, customs, and expectations of court life. It was not merely a matter of pride but a means of survival and advancement. The English court was a web of alliances and rivalries, where marriages, friendships, and patronage dictated one's future. In this setting, the Parr family's prominence offered Catherine not only security but also an unparalleled education in the subtleties of power, diplomacy, and self-presentation. Even as a child, she would have been acutely aware of the significance of her heritage and the responsibilities that came with it. The death of her father when Catherine was still young had a profound impact on her upbringing. It fell to her mother, Maud Green, to oversee her children's education and ensure that they fulfilled the family's expectations. Unlike many women of her time, Maud Green placed extraordinary importance on education, both for her son, William, and for her daughters, Catherine and Anne. Catherine Parr's education was thus remarkably comprehensive and advanced, especially for a woman in the early 1500s. While many girls were taught little beyond the rudiments of household management and perhaps some reading, Catherine was immersed in a curriculum that emphasized literacy, languages, religion, history, and the arts. Fluent in Latin and competent in French and Italian, Catherine demonstrated a facility with languages that would later define her as an author and intellectual. Her education also included an intensive study of theology, an area that would profoundly shape her later life and reputation. The influence of Renaissance humanism, which emphasized classical learning and the moral and intellectual development of the individual, was evident in her studies. She was encouraged not merely to absorb knowledge but to think critically, to engage with ideas, and to articulate her thoughts clearly and persuasively. This rigorous intellectual preparation was rare for women of her time and set her apart from many of her contemporaries. Maud Green's role in Catherine's life cannot be overstated. As a widow tasked with managing her family's future, Maud exemplified resilience, strategic thinking, and dignity, traits that Catherine absorbed and would later exhibit in abundance. Maud's position at court as a lady-in-waiting offered Catherine not only an example of how to navigate the often perilous waters of royal service, but also a network of influential connections that would serve her throughout her life. Through her mother's example and instruction, Catherine learned the importance of discretion, loyalty, and adaptability, qualities that would become her armor in the tumultuous years ahead. From an early age, Catherine Parr displayed a personality marked by intelligence, composure, and resilience. These were not merely innate traits but ones honed by the expectations placed upon her and the environment in which she was raised. Her intelligence was evident not just in her academic achievements but in her emotional acuity, her ability to read situations and people, and her foresight in managing relationships and opportunities. In a court culture where favor could be won and lost in a moment, Catherine's early ability to maintain composure under pressure became one of her defining characteristics. She understood intuitively when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to withdraw, skills that would prove vital in her survival and eventual success as queen. Catherine's resilience was tested early through personal loss and family responsibility. The death of her father left a void that placed greater expectations on her young shoulders. Although she grew up in relative comfort compared to the majority of English society, the pressures of maintaining family honor, securing advantageous marriages, and navigating court politics were real and ever-present. Catherine demonstrated from an early age a remarkable ability to endure adversity without bitterness, to adjust to changing circumstances without losing her core identity. It is a testament to her strength of character that she would later endure not only personal losses and political dangers, but also the immense personal risks associated with religious reform during a period of intense doctrinal upheaval. In addition to her intellectual and emotional maturity, Catherine Parr exhibited a natural grace and dignity that endeared her to those around her. She was not renowned for great beauty, as some of Henry VIII's other wives were, but she possessed an inner poise and a genuine warmth that drew admiration. These qualities, coupled with her keen mind and resilient spirit, would make her an ideal consort not only for Henry VIII, but also for the many influential figures she encountered throughout her life. Her early life also instilled in her a profound sense of duty, to her family, to her faith, and to her country. This sense of obligation would be a guiding principle throughout her marriages and her political and religious activities. It was not enough, in Catherine's mind, to survive. She sought to serve, to contribute, and to leave a legacy of moral and intellectual integrity. This sense of mission, rooted in her early upbringing, would later drive her efforts at religious reform, her patronage of the arts, and her authorship of significant devotional literature. Catherine Parr's early life was shaped by noble blood, strategic family connections, an exceptional education, and the indelible influence of a strong and capable mother. She grew up with a clear understanding of her place in the social hierarchy and the expectations that accompanied it. Yet, rather than being constrained by these expectations, she used them as a foundation upon which to build an extraordinary life. Her intelligence, composure, and resilience, evident from a young age, would become the hallmarks of her character, enabling her not only to survive the treacherous world of Tudor politics but to leave an enduring mark on English history. These early formative experiences set the stage for Catherine Parr's remarkable journey, a journey that would see her rise to become a queen, a regent, a reformer, and a survivor, remembered not merely as the last wife of Henry VIII, but as a woman of profound strength and lasting influence. Catherine Parr's introduction into marriage life began in her teenage years, setting her on a path filled with personal challenges, political entanglements, and growing resilience. Her first marriage was to Sir Edward Berg, a member of an established but declining noble family. Contrary to earlier misconceptions, Edward was not the elderly figure sometimes depicted in popular accounts. Rather, he was relatively close in age to Catherine. Still, the match was not one of romantic inclination but rather of strategic alliance, typical of the time. Through this union, Catherine entered a complex and, at times, stifling household that demanded she quickly develop the diplomatic skills and quiet fortitude that would later define her. The Berg family lived under the heavy influence of Sir Thomas Berg, Edward's grandfather, a notoriously domineering and difficult man. Thomas Berg's rigid control over the family's affairs and his oppressive management of household matters created a fraught environment for Catherine. She found herself a young bride not only adjusting to married life but also navigating the challenging and, at times, hostile atmosphere imposed by an overbearing patriarch. The manor at Gainsborough, where the Bergs resided, was a cold, isolated and austere place, far from the vibrant courts Catherine had occasionally glimpsed during her early years. Life at Gainsborough was restrictive and offered few outlets for the intelligence and vivacity that were essential elements of Catherine's character. Edward Berg's health, both mental and physical, was fragile. Although records are somewhat unclear, it is widely believed he suffered from chronic illness, a fact that only compounded Catherine's isolation and difficulties. Their marriage remained childless, possibly due to Edward's poor health. In these early years of her adulthood, Catherine learned much about endurance and discretion, qualities that would later serve her well in far more perilous circumstances. Edward's death came relatively quickly after their marriage, around 1533, leaving Catherine a widow in her early 20s, a precarious position for a woman of that time. Widowhood presented both dangers and opportunities. It could leave a woman vulnerable to economic hardship and social marginalization, but also offered a measure of independence not available to married women. Following Edward's death, Catherine, now with some experience in managing estates and navigating familial politics, did not remain unattached for long. Her second marriage would elevate her status and deepen her involvement in the broader affairs of the kingdom. She married John Neville, the third Baron Latimer, a nobleman of considerable influence in the north of England. This marriage was a considerable step upward in social standing for Catherine. Neville was a widower with 2 children, and the marriage may have initially been more pragmatic than passionate, though evidence suggests a deep mutual respect and possibly genuine affection developed between them over time. Life in the north of England introduced Catherine to a vastly different social and political world compared to her previous experience with the Berg family. The Latimer estates were substantial, and Catherine took on the demanding role of managing these properties and overseeing her stepchildren's upbringing. Her responsibilities extended beyond the domestic sphere. As the wife of a northern lord, she was thrust into the volatile political environment that characterized the Tudor North, where tensions between the crown and regional powers often simmered close to the surface. These tensions exploded into open rebellion in 1536 during the Pilgrimage of Grace, a widespread uprising that protested Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries and other religious reforms. The rebellion was a critical and dangerous period for Catherine. John Neville was caught between loyalty to the king and sympathy for the rebels, many of whom were his neighbors and allies. Although Neville ultimately sided with the crown, suspicions about his true loyalties lingered for years. During this time, Catherine and her stepchildren were effectively held hostage by rebel forces at Snape Castle, their home in Yorkshire. The experience was harrowing and deeply formative for Catherine. She demonstrated remarkable composure and courage during this crisis, negotiating as best she could with the rebels while remaining steadfastly loyal to her husband and the king. Accounts suggest that Catherine managed to protect herself and her family through a combination of prudence, negotiation, and sheer resilience. These events forced Catherine into a role of leadership under extreme pressure, sharpening her political instincts and deepening her understanding of the precariousness of power and influence in Tudor England. The aftermath of the Pilgrimage of Grace left Catherine and her family under royal scrutiny, and though they survived politically, the experience exacted a heavy emotional toll. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of the rebellion lingered over the Latimers. Over the next few years, Catherine continued to oversee the estates and care for her stepchildren, developing a reputation for capable management and compassionate stewardship. However, the death of John Neville in 1543 once again threw Catherine into the vulnerable position of widowhood. This second widowhood presented Catherine with significant financial and emotional challenges. Neville's death left her with a complicated estate to manage and considerable debts to settle. As a widow, Catherine had limited legal rights and was reliant on the goodwill of male relatives and the crown to secure her future. Yet Catherine's resourcefulness and intelligence allowed her to navigate these obstacles with a degree of success. She leveraged her connections and her reputation for prudence to stabilize her position, though the years following Neville's death were marked by uncertainty. Emotionally, Catherine was deeply affected by Neville's death. Although their marriage may have begun as a strategic alliance, it grew into a partnership based on mutual respect and perhaps even affection. Catherine's letters from this period reveal a woman of deep feeling and steadfast loyalty, qualities often overlooked by contemporaries who focused more on her political and social roles. Her capacity for deep emotional attachment would later become evident in her subsequent relationships, most notably with Thomas Seymour. Financially, Catherine faced the daunting task of securing her own livelihood in a society where a woman's financial independence was rare and often suspect. She sought and obtained the protection of the court, moving into the orbit of Henry VIII's court soon after her husband's death. This move was both practical and strategic. Proximity to the king and his advisors offered opportunities for advancement that were otherwise closed to a woman in her position. During this period, Catherine also began to deepen her religious convictions, moving increasingly toward the reformist Protestant ideas that were slowly gaining ground in England. Her interest in religious reform would become a defining feature of her later life, shaping her decisions and her legacy. This spiritual evolution also provided Catherine with a sense of purpose and resilience as she faced the uncertainties of her second widowhood. The combination of personal loss, financial challenge, and political navigation forged Catherine into a figure of considerable strength and poise. She emerged from these early marriages not embittered or broken, but rather seasoned and sharpened by adversity. Catherine Parr was no longer the naive young bride who had entered the Berg household years earlier. She had become a woman of formidable intelligence, resilience, and political acumen. These qualities would soon capture the attention of King Henry VIII himself, setting the stage for the most consequential chapter of her extraordinary life. In many ways, the experiences of her first two marriages prepared Catherine for the complexities and dangers she would face as queen consort to one of England's most infamous monarchs. She had learned how to manage large households, navigate treacherous political waters, and maintain personal integrity amid intense pressure. She understood the delicate balance between loyalty and survival, between personal conviction and public expectation. These were lessons learned not in the glittering halls of court, but in the often harsh and unforgiving realities of English noble life. Her early experiences also imbued her with a deep empathy for others, particularly women who faced similar challenges. This empathy would later manifest in her patronage of religious publications, her advocacy for education, and her careful mentorship of her stepchildren during her marriage to Henry VIII. Catherine's first two marriages thus formed the bedrock upon which her later achievements were built, shaping her into one of the most remarkable women of the Tudor age. After the death of John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, Catherine Parr found herself at a critical crossroads. She was once again a widow, now twice bereaved, but she was no longer the inexperienced young woman who had married Sir Edward Berg years earlier. Catherine had matured through hardship and responsibility, and now possessed a keen understanding of both personal and political survival. Her connections through marriage, and her growing reputation for intelligence and virtue, positioned her for a return to a world she had long observed from a distance, the royal court. In the aftermath of her second widowhood, Catherine made the strategic decision to leave the north of England and re-enter court life. The political centre of Tudor England was where decisions were made, where fortunes were lost and won, and where, for a woman of Catherine's circumstances, opportunities awaited those with the wit and caution to seize them. Unlike many women who had fallen into poverty following the deaths of their husbands, Catherine was determined not to fade into obscurity. She moved to London, likely with the aim of securing a place within one of the royal households, either through service or remarriage. Her return to court was facilitated by her personal connections and her noble background. Catherine had always been aligned with families loyal to the crown, and her own reputation was spotless. She was soon appointed to Princess Mary's household, a significant and prestigious position. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had endured years of personal and political turmoil due to her father's marital decisions and religious reforms. Her court was a gathering place for those who remained sympathetic to the old Catholic traditions and to the memory of Catherine of Aragon. Catherine Parr's appointment to Mary's household was both a testament to her character and a key opportunity to position herself within a circle that still wielded considerable influence. In the service of Princess Mary, Catherine's warmth, education, and empathy quickly distinguished her. She and Mary shared a strong bond, likely strengthened by Catherine's own deep piety and her familiarity with the hardships that accompanied political life. Catherine's ability to navigate delicate religious and political matters with subtlety made her a trusted figure within Mary's circle. She provided Mary with companionship, support, and perhaps most importantly, a model of survival through adversity. Their relationship would remain important throughout Catherine's life, especially later when political fortunes continued to shift violently. While serving Mary, Catherine expanded her network at court. She met and formed connections with a range of influential figures, many of whom were themselves navigating the uncertain waters of Henry VIII's increasingly volatile reign. Catherine's position allowed her to meet men and women of significant stature, including courtiers, clerics, and noblemen who recognized her intelligence and discretion. She quickly became known for her modesty, grace, and keen mind, qualities that, at a time when the king's court was rife with intrigue and ambition, made her stand out without drawing dangerous levels of attention. Among those she encountered was Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. Thomas was handsome, ambitious, and very aware of his own charms. There was mutual attraction between Catherine and Thomas, and some evidence suggests that a romantic understanding between them was beginning to develop. However, the volatile nature of life at court, combined with the enormous influence wielded by the Seymour family, made any potential match between Catherine and Thomas a matter of political calculation rather than pure affection. Catherine was wise enough to understand the stakes involved, and she tread carefully, even as her feelings deepened. As Catherine moved more securely within the court's inner circles, she inevitably came to the attention of King Henry VIII himself. By this time, Henry was aging and ailing. His physical health was deteriorating, plagued by leg ulcers, obesity, and the lingering consequences of earlier injuries, and his temper was infamously mercurial. His marital history was notorious: 6 wives in total, 2 executed, 2 divorced, and 1 who had died giving him his long-sought male heir. Despite the dangers inherent in royal favor, for a woman at court, Henry's attention could represent the ultimate elevation in status, provided it was managed with extreme caution. Henry's interest in Catherine seems to have been genuine and rooted in admiration for her character rather than mere physical attraction. Catherine's learnedness, her religious devotion, and her steady temperament appealed to the king in ways that younger and more coquettish courtiers could not. She represented the virtues of loyalty, piety, and stability that Henry, perhaps subconsciously, desired after years of tumultuous personal relationships. Catherine, meanwhile, was faced with a staggering decision: whether to pursue the private affection she held for Thomas Seymour or to accept the attention and potential proposal of the King of England. Her choice was not truly a choice at all. In the tightly controlled environment of Henry's court, where the king's will was law, to refuse the king's advances would have been unthinkable and perilous. Catherine's religious devotion, her sense of duty, and her political savvy guided her decision to accept Henry's attentions. In doing so, she not only protected herself but also secured a platform from which she could promote her reformist religious ideas, albeit carefully and within the confines of royal favor. The period during which Henry courted Catherine was marked by a subtle but important transformation in her life. She shifted from the role of a peripheral courtier to that of a central figure in the king's household. Catherine moved among the highest-ranking members of the court, attended official ceremonies, and participated in the social rituals that underpinned Tudor political life. She maintained her modesty and religious devotion, projecting an image of ideal queenship even before any formal announcement was made. Through her relationship with Henry, Catherine gained an unprecedented level of influence. She was able to advocate for scholars, promote religious works aligned with her views, and offer patronage to reform-minded clerics and writers. Yet she did so with the utmost care, aware that Henry's religious policies, while favoring reform in some areas, were inconsistent and could swing violently depending on political expediency. Catherine's ability to balance her personal convictions with the need to maintain royal favor was a testament to her intelligence and political acumen. Catherine's growing favor with the king also increased her visibility and, with it, the envy and resentment of others at court. In the highly competitive environment of Tudor politics, any elevation was viewed with suspicion and jealousy. Rivals watched her carefully, ready to exploit any misstep. Catherine's survival and eventual marriage to Henry would depend on her continuing ability to manage the treacherous undercurrents of court life, balancing ambition with humility, religious devotion with political necessity, and personal feeling with public duty. As Henry's courtship progressed, Catherine prepared herself for a role that would demand all the skills she had honed throughout her life. She would not be a queen in the mold of Anne Boleyn, dazzling but divisive, nor would she be a passive figure like Jane Seymour. Catherine envisioned a queenship that combined moral leadership with political savvy, offering Henry the companionship and stability he so desperately sought. In doing so, she carved out a unique place for herself in the annals of Tudor history, a place she would solidify through her actions in the tumultuous years ahead. Thus, Catherine Parr, twice widowed and seasoned by hardship, found herself standing on the threshold of becoming queen. Her return to court, her service to Princess Mary, her careful cultivation of alliances, and her composed acceptance of the king's attention all coalesced into a remarkable transformation. From the quiet halls of Snape Castle to the glittering corridors of the royal palaces, Catherine's journey was not just one of personal advancement but also one of survival, principle, and emerging influence in one of the most dangerous courts in European history. Catherine Parr's rise from court widow to Queen of England was neither simple nor straightforward. At the time of King Henry VIII's growing interest in her, Catherine found herself trapped between personal desire and political necessity. Her heart had already begun to incline toward Thomas Seymour, a charming and ambitious courtier whose attentions had not gone unnoticed. Thomas, the brother of Jane Seymour, the late queen who had given Henry his longed-for male heir, was handsome, persuasive, and very much alive in the ambitions of his family. Catherine and Thomas shared mutual affection, and perhaps in another life, free from royal commands and courtly intrigue, they might have married for love alone. But the court of Henry VIII was not a place where personal feelings could be freely followed. Catherine understood the weight of the king's favor. To refuse Henry, even on the grounds of prior affection, was not only impractical, it was dangerous. Henry VIII was not a man accustomed to denial, and although his interest in Catherine seemed grounded in admiration rather than sheer lust, rejection could have had grave consequences for her, her family, and even Thomas Seymour himself. Catherine, with her keen intelligence and deep understanding of survival at court, realized that she could not follow her heart without risking everything. King Henry's pursuit of Catherine was both swift and commanding. Despite his declining health and volatile temper, Henry remained every inch the monarch, and his attentions were impossible to resist. He lavished Catherine with gifts and courtesies, treating her with a tenderness that he had not often shown to his previous wives. For Henry, Catherine represented not only personal comfort in his old age but also a stabilizing influence. She was pious without being overbearing, intelligent without being threatening, and attractive in a way that spoke more to her grace and composure than to youthful beauty. Catherine's reluctance was real, but it was buried under layers of political obligation and personal caution. In the spring of 1543, Henry proposed marriage, and Catherine, with no real alternative, accepted. It is possible that she took comfort in the belief that her union with the king might enable her to act as a force for good at court, promoting religious reform and providing stability for the king's children. Whatever her private sorrows over abandoning Thomas Seymour, Catherine moved forward with dignity and resolve. On July 12, 1543, Catherine Parr became the sixth wife of Henry VIII in a quiet ceremony at Hampton Court Palace. The marriage was witnessed only by a small group of courtiers, a contrast to the grand public spectacles that had accompanied some of Henry's earlier unions. Catherine wore a gown of rich satin and damask, reflecting her new status but also signaling a certain sobriety befitting a woman who approached the role of queen not as a fairy tale, but as a solemn duty. She was about 30 years old at the time, neither too young nor too old by the standards of the day, but already wise far beyond her years. Adjusting to life as queen consort was both a challenge and a balancing act. Catherine understood immediately that she would be measured against the memories of Henry's previous wives. She needed to embody the virtue and loyalty of Catherine of Aragon, the sweetness and motherhood of Jane Seymour, the charisma of Anne Boleyn, but without the fatal boldness, and the obedience that Henry demanded above all. Her success would depend on her ability to navigate not only the king's volatile moods but also the dangerous currents of court politics, where factions vied for influence and enemies lurked in every shadow. One of Catherine's first priorities as queen was to mend the fractured royal family. Henry's relationships with his children had been severely damaged by his marital upheavals and religious policies. Catherine took it upon herself to bring a semblance of domestic harmony to the royal household. She showed genuine affection toward Princess Mary and Prince Edward and treated Princess Elizabeth with particular kindness, recognizing the brilliance and potential of the young girl. Catherine's efforts were successful enough that Henry formally returned both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, after they had previously been declared illegitimate. Beyond the domestic sphere, Catherine wielded considerable political influence, albeit subtly. She was a strong supporter of the English Reformation and the advancement of Protestant ideals, although she practiced discretion in her advocacy. Catherine was careful never to appear radical. Instead, she framed her religious interests in the language of personal piety and education, promoting the idea that women, too, could engage in theological study. She encouraged the publication of religious works in English and supported scholars and clerics aligned with reformist views. Catherine herself would later publish religious texts, a remarkable achievement for a queen and one that reflected both her intellect and her courage. Yet Catherine's position was far from secure. Court politics during Henry's later years were treacherous, as powerful factions battled for dominance. The conservative faction, led by figures such as Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, viewed Catherine's Protestant leanings with suspicion. They watched her closely, waiting for an opportunity to undermine her. At the same time, the reformist faction, associated with figures like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, saw Catherine as a crucial ally and worked quietly to protect her. Henry's own moods were a constant threat. His health was worsening, and with it came bouts of deep paranoia and cruelty. Catherine had to exercise extraordinary tact to maintain his favor. She engaged him in theological discussions, flattering his intellect while carefully deferring to his ultimate authority. She soothed his tempers with patience and tended to his many physical ailments with a combination of deference and firmness. Catherine became not just a wife but a nurse, companion, and in many ways, a caretaker of the king's declining body and spirit. The marriage between Henry and Catherine, though lacking in passion, was marked by a surprising degree of mutual respect. Henry appreciated Catherine's loyalty and her ability to manage the court's domestic affairs. He trusted her enough to leave her as regent when he embarked on a military campaign in France in 1544. A significant sign of confidence in her capabilities. During his absence, Catherine governed England with prudence, maintaining stability and ensuring the continuation of royal authority. Her regency was a success, further solidifying her reputation as a capable and intelligent queen. Nevertheless, dangers remained ever present. In 1546, the conservative faction sought to bring down Catherine by exploiting her interest in religious reform. They accused her of heresy, a charge that carried the death penalty. Catherine, learning of the plot, responded with remarkable shrewdness. She approached the king and portrayed her religious discussions as mere attempts to distract and comfort him, acknowledging his supreme wisdom and claiming no intention to challenge his views. Henry, mollified and perhaps amused by her cleverness, forgave her and turned against those who had sought to destroy her. Catherine's survival was a testament not only to her quick thinking but also to her profound understanding of the king's psychology. Throughout her marriage to Henry, Catherine continued to support education and the arts. She fostered an environment in which learning was valued, encouraging her stepchildren to study languages, history, and theology. Elizabeth, in particular, benefited from Catherine's example and influence, developing the intellectual rigor that would later characterize her own reign. Catherine's emphasis on education for women was revolutionary for the time and would have a lasting impact far beyond the court. Privately, Catherine maintained her faith in reformist ideals, corresponding with scholars and theologians who shared her vision for a more spiritually accessible church. She read extensively, wrote prayers and meditations, and prepared herself spiritually for the uncertainties of life in a court where favor could be lost in an instant. Her writings reveal a woman of deep introspection, compassion, and resilience, a queen who understood both the burdens of power and the fleeting nature of earthly authority. As Henry's health deteriorated further, the court became a place of quiet waiting, filled with anxiety about what the future might hold. Factions positioned themselves for the inevitable succession struggle, and Catherine, though still queen, had to tread carefully to ensure her safety once Henry was gone. She remained a model of patience and devotion to the very end, tending to the increasingly irascible king as his strength faded. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, Catherine was widowed for the third time. Her role as queen ended, but her influence remained. She had survived one of the most dangerous marriages in English history, not through beauty or blind obedience, but through intelligence, adaptability, and profound emotional strength. Catherine Parr's marriage to Henry VIII was not a love story in the traditional sense. It was a testament to duty, endurance, and the complex art of survival in a world where the personal was always political and the stakes were often a matter of life and death. When Catherine Parr married Henry VIII, she stepped into a role that extended far beyond that of queen consort. She became a stepmother to 3 royal children, each bearing the marks of a tumultuous upbringing scarred by their father's marital adventures and religious upheavals. These were not ordinary children but heirs and symbols of England's future, each bearing a complex legacy. Catherine's relationship with Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward would become one of the most profound aspects of her life and reign, defining her not just as Henry's wife but as a maternal figure of intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight. Catherine's first challenge was to navigate the delicate and strained relationship between Henry and his 2 daughters. Both Mary and Elizabeth had suffered humiliations because of their mother's falls from grace. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had seen her beloved mother divorced, her own status downgraded from princess to lady, and her legitimacy questioned. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, had similarly been declared illegitimate after her mother's execution. The emotional scars left on both young women were deep, and although Henry had occasionally shown signs of affection, he had never fully trusted either daughter again. Only Edward, son of Jane Seymour, stood in Henry's unshakable favor, being the long-awaited male heir. Catherine Parr approached these fraught dynamics with a sensitivity that was rare at court. She treated Mary and Elizabeth with the respect due to their royal blood, regardless of their fluctuating legal status. Catherine understood the importance of appearances as well as genuine affection. She made sure the princesses were included in court ceremonies, treated with dignity, and given a sense of belonging that had long been absent from their lives. She also extended this maternal care to Edward, recognizing his vulnerability as a young boy surrounded by ambitious men eager to shape the future king to their advantage. Education was one of Catherine's great passions, and she believed fervently in the power of knowledge to elevate and empower. She was a well-educated woman herself, fluent in several languages and deeply versed in theology, and she championed the idea that women, no less than men, should be afforded intellectual development. Catherine extended this philosophy to her royal stepchildren, advocating for rigorous, humanist educations that would prepare them not only for the demands of monarchy but also for thoughtful, virtuous lives. Under Catherine's influence, Elizabeth's education, in particular, flourished. Recognizing Elizabeth's exceptional intelligence, Catherine ensured she had access to the best tutors and a curriculum that emphasized languages, philosophy, history, and classical literature. Elizabeth would eventually become one of the most learned women of her age, and much of the foundation for this brilliance was laid during Catherine's tenure as her stepmother. Mary, though older and less inclined to embrace the Protestant-leaning humanism that Catherine favored, also benefited from the Queen's insistence on dignity and education. Even Edward, the much-protected heir, was encouraged in his studies, developing a scholarly rigor that would later define his short reign. Catherine's efforts went beyond education. she became a force for reconciliation between Henry and his daughters. At a time when women were expected to be passive ornaments at court, Catherine took bold and deliberate steps to heal the emotional wounds that Henry's actions had inflicted on Mary and Elizabeth. She encouraged Henry to soften his stance toward his daughters, often speaking to him privately about the benefits of unity within the royal family. Through gentle persuasion, she reminded him that the strength of his dynasty rested not only on Edward but on the loyalty and stability that Mary and Elizabeth could provide. Her efforts bore fruit. In 1544, Henry VIII restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession through the Third Succession Act, after Edward. While their legitimacy was not fully reinstated, the fact that they were legally recognized as heirs once again was a tremendous victory, and much of the credit for this shift belongs to Catherine's quiet diplomacy. She understood the art of influence at a time when open confrontation would have been disastrous, and she used her position not for personal aggrandizement but for the greater good of the family and the realm. Catherine's influence on Elizabeth I cannot be overstated. Beyond arranging her education and helping to secure her political future, Catherine provided Elizabeth with a living example of female authority exercised with intelligence and grace. Elizabeth observed in Catherine a model of how a woman could wield power, navigate danger, and maintain her dignity in a male-dominated world. Catherine's blend of scholarship, political savvy, and personal piety left an indelible mark on the young princess. The lessons Elizabeth absorbed during these formative years would later echo in her own reign, particularly in her careful balancing of religious factions, her strategic use of marriage negotiations, and her cultivation of an image of learned majesty. After Henry's death in January 1547, Catherine's maternal role did not end. She acted as a guardian and mentor to Elizabeth, taking her into her household along with her new husband, Thomas Seymour, whom Catherine had finally married after years of delayed affection. Catherine's home became a vibrant intellectual and cultural center, where scholars, writers, and reformers gathered, and where Elizabeth continued her studies under the best tutors. This environment further shaped Elizabeth's keen mind and prepared her for the political complexities she would later master as queen. However, Catherine's later years were not free from personal tragedy. Her marriage to Thomas Seymour, though born of genuine affection, proved tumultuous. Seymour's ambitions and questionable behavior, particularly his inappropriate conduct toward the adolescent Elizabeth, brought turmoil into Catherine's final months. Despite her heartbreak, Catherine sought to protect Elizabeth's reputation and future, once again putting the needs of her stepdaughter above her own. Catherine Parr's death in 1548, following the birth of her only child, left a void in the lives of the royal children she had so tenderly nurtured. Yet her impact endured. Edward, in his brief reign, showed a seriousness of purpose and a scholarly mind that reflected Catherine's influence. Mary, despite the eventual religious conflict that would arise between her and Elizabeth, retained a respect for the importance of royal dignity and authority that Catherine had emphasized. Most profoundly, Elizabeth carried forward the example Catherine had set, embodying a model of queenship that was learned, poised, and masterfully self-controlled. Catherine Parr's role as stepmother was remarkable not only for the affection she fostered but for the practical and political gains she achieved on behalf of her stepchildren. In an age when queens were often marginalized or scapegoated, she carved out a role of genuine importance and positive influence. Her vision of a learned, united royal family helped stabilize the Tudor dynasty at a critical moment and sowed the seeds for the later successes of Elizabethan England. Through patience, intelligence, and genuine love, Catherine transformed the lives of Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. She helped heal old wounds, provided a model of enlightened queenship, and laid the groundwork for a future in which a woman could rule England with brilliance and authority. Her legacy lived on most clearly in Elizabeth I, whose reign would come to symbolize a golden age of learning, power, and cultural flourishing. Behind the towering figure of the Virgin Queen stood the steady, guiding hand of Catherine Parr, a stepmother in title, a mother in spirit, and one of the unsung architects of England's greatest era. In the summer of 1544, as Henry VIII embarked on his military campaign in France, the responsibility of governing England in his absence fell upon Catherine Parr. This was a remarkable decision on Henry's part, given the deeply patriarchal society in which he ruled. It reflected not only his personal trust in Catherine but also an acknowledgement of her intelligence, administrative ability, and steady temperament. Although queens had occasionally served in regency roles in earlier periods of English history, it was still an extraordinary vote of confidence for a woman to wield such authority during a king's absence, especially during a time of war and political instability. As regent, Catherine Parr was granted considerable powers, a fact often overlooked in popular accounts of her life. Henry's departure for France, where he intended to capture Boulogne and reinforce English claims on French soil, left the kingdom vulnerable to both internal unrest and external threats, particularly from Scotland and potentially even from European Catholic powers that regarded Henry's break with Rome as heretical. In this volatile context, Catherine was entrusted with managing not only the ordinary functions of government but also the broader defense of the realm. One of Catherine's greatest strengths as regent was her ability to manage internal politics. The English court was a labyrinth of competing factions, ambitious nobles, and self-serving advisors, all seeking to increase their influence during the king's absence. Catherine navigated this treacherous environment with remarkable skill, maintaining a delicate balance between the powerful interests at court. She relied on a council of trusted advisors, but it was clear that she played a central role in decision-making, rather than serving as a mere figurehead. Her ability to maintain stability at court, to prevent factional struggles from spiraling into open conflict, and to preserve the authority of the crown during a vulnerable period demonstrated an acute political intelligence. Catherine also showed herself adept at managing external threats. The most pressing danger during Henry's absence was the ongoing hostility with Scotland, a conflict that had intensified following the death of James V and the accession of the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. English forces were engaged in a brutal campaign along the border, known as the Rough Wooing, intended to force a marriage alliance between Mary and Prince Edward. Catherine, through her Regency Council, ensured that these military operations continued effectively, providing logistical support and maintaining pressure on the Scots while avoiding the costly overreach that could have destabilized England's northern frontier. Her regency also required her to manage the broader defense of England's coasts against possible French retaliation. With Henry's forces occupied across the Channel, Catherine took steps to strengthen coastal fortifications and ensure the readiness of local militias. This involved overseeing the allocation of funds, supplies, and manpower, a complex and demanding administrative task that she managed with a calm and methodical approach. The absence of any major foreign incursion during Henry's campaign is a testament in part to the competence with which Catherine and her council handled England's defences. Throughout her regency, Catherine demonstrated an impressive grasp of political authority. She understood the importance of symbolism and statecraft, projecting an image of stability and continuity that reassured both the English people and the international community. She conducted official ceremonies, issued royal proclamations, and corresponded with foreign dignitaries, always mindful that she represented the person of the king. Catherine's correspondence during this period reveals a woman who was confident in exercising power yet careful to always frame her authority as deriving from Henry himself, thus avoiding the appearance of overreaching, a critical political calculation in a society deeply wary of female rule. Yet it would be a mistake to see Catherine's regency as merely conservative or deferential. Beneath her careful public image, Catherine used her position to quietly advance causes she cared about, particularly religious reform. She surrounded herself with reform-minded advisors and gave her patronage to scholars and theologians who advocated for a more Protestant-leaning Church of England. While she was careful not to provoke conservative elements at court, Catherine's regency subtly shifted the religious climate of England further toward reform, laying groundwork that would later bear fruit during the reigns of Edward VI and Elizabeth I. The impact of Catherine's regency on England's governance during Henry's absence was profound, if not always immediately recognized. She proved that a woman could effectively govern a kingdom, manage complex political dynamics, oversee military operations, and maintain both internal stability and external security. Her success during this period helped to challenge lingering prejudices about female capability, at least among those in power who witnessed her regency firsthand. It also set a critical precedent for the future. The idea that a woman could act as a ruler, not merely a consort, would become an essential part of the political landscape as England later faced the reigns of Mary I and Elizabeth I. Moreover, Catherine's regency helped to solidify the administrative structures that would characterize later Tudor governance. She worked closely with the Privy Council, reinforcing its role as a body capable of managing state affairs even in the monarch's absence. This reliance on a strong, centralized council rather than a single overmighty favorite would become a hallmark of Elizabeth I's rule, and there is little doubt that Elizabeth, observing Catherine's regency as a young girl, internalized many of the lessons about balancing power, consulting advisors, and maintaining sovereign authority without alienating key political players. In a broader sense, Catherine's regency highlighted the importance of continuity and legitimacy in governance. By maintaining Henry's policies and ensuring that his authority was visibly upheld, she preserved the stability of the Tudor state at a time when instability could have led to rebellion or invasion. Her careful stewardship during the king's absence helped ensure that England remained a cohesive, functioning kingdom ready to welcome back its king rather than one torn apart by factionalism or weakened by external attack. Catherine's regency was not without its challenges. She had to deal with rumors, intrigues, and the ever-present risk that any mistake could be seized upon by enemies at court eager to discredit her. Yet she managed these risks with a calm, steady hand, never allowing herself to become the target of scandal or the victim of political maneuvering. Her experience as a noblewoman, widow, and queen had taught her the value of discretion, and she applied these lessons effectively during her time as regent. When Henry returned from France, victorious but in failing health, he found a kingdom that had been well governed and stable in his absence. Though he did not lavish public praise on Catherine, it was not Henry's nature to share credit easily. His continued trust in her and her increasing influence over his final years testify to his appreciation for the way she had managed the realm. Catherine's regency thus stands as one of the quieter but most impressive chapters in her remarkable life, a period when she proved herself not only a consort but a capable ruler in her own right. Ultimately, Catherine Parr's time as regent during Henry's 1544 campaign left a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the war with France. It demonstrated that a woman, given authority and responsibility, could govern effectively in a time of national uncertainty. It strengthened the administrative frameworks of the English government, supported the progress of religious reform, and provided a model of female leadership that would inspire future generations. Quietly, competently, and with a deep sense of duty, Catherine Parr had shown herself to be a queen not merely by marriage but by merit, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Tudor England. Catherine Parr's religious beliefs were a complex and evolving aspect of her life, shaped by both her personal convictions and the tumultuous religious environment of 16th-century England. As the wife of Henry VIII, she found herself at the heart of one of the most significant periods in English religious history, the English Reformation. Catherine's journey from a Catholic upbringing to her later Protestant sympathies was not just a personal transformation, but also a reflection of the wider shifts within the English court and the nation. Throughout her life, she was a strong advocate for reform, yet her beliefs were shaped by pragmatism as much as they were by her convictions, especially in an era when religious affiliation could determine one's fate. Born in 1512, Catherine Parr was raised in a Catholic family, consistent with the religious environment of England at the time. Her family, part of the English nobility, was deeply entrenched in the Catholic traditions that had defined the Kingdom of England for centuries. Her early education and upbringing were shaped by the teachings of the Catholic Church, and it is likely that she was well versed in Catholic doctrines, particularly those regarding the role of the clergy, the sacraments, and the importance of tradition in religious practice. However, as Catherine matured, so too did the religious climate in England. The break with Rome, initiated by Henry VIII's desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon and Mary Anne Boleyn, heralded the beginning of the English Reformation, a process that would irreversibly change the face of religion in England. Catherine's religious beliefs began to shift as the Reformation gained momentum in England. While she was undoubtedly influenced by the royal court's evolving stance on religion, her personal beliefs leaned toward the reformist ideas that were beginning to take hold. Henry's establishment of the Church of England, separate from the authority of the Pope, had already set the stage for widespread religious reform. Although Henry VIII remained doctrinally conservative in many respects, Catherine found herself drawn to the Protestant ideas that were becoming more prominent within certain circles of the English court. By the time she married Henry in 1543, Catherine's personal faith was already deeply influenced by Protestant ideals, particularly those relating to scripture and the role of the clergy. One of Catherine's most significant actions during her time as queen was her patronage of reformist scholars and theologians. Catherine surrounded herself with individuals who shared her growing Protestant sympathies, many of whom were scholars advocating for a more scripture-centered Christianity. These included figures like Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer, two of the most prominent Protestant theologians in England at the time. Catherine's support for these reformers was not merely intellectual. It was a political statement. By aligning herself with the reformist cause, she was demonstrating her commitment to the emerging Protestant ethos that was gaining ground in England. Catherine's patronage of reformist theologians was not limited to her court circles but also extended to her personal life. She frequently hosted intellectual gatherings at court, where discussions on theology and religious reform were commonplace. These discussions were more than casual debates. They were part of the broader efforts to promote religious change in England. Catherine's role in this intellectual movement should not be underestimated. Her position as queen gave her a platform to support theological reform and to lend legitimacy to the ideas of the Protestant reformers. At the heart of Catherine's religious journey was her private study of scripture. She was an avid reader, and her intellectual pursuits were often centered around the Bible and theological texts. She was particularly drawn to the works of Protestant reformers such as Martin Luther and William Tyndale, whose translations of the Bible into English had begun to challenge the authority of the clergy and the Latin Vulgate. Catherine's private study of the Bible allowed her to explore Christian doctrine from a more personal and intimate perspective. Her engagement with Scripture was not just an intellectual exercise but also a spiritual one. She sought solace, guidance, and inspiration from her studies, and this deepened her commitment to Protestant ideas, particularly the notion that individuals should have direct access to the Bible and the ability to interpret it for themselves. Her religious practices reflected her evolving beliefs. While Catherine continued to honor traditional Catholic customs, such as attending Mass and supporting the Church's charitable endeavors, she also incorporated Protestant elements into her private devotional life. She prayed in a personal and intimate manner, often reading scripture aloud or meditating on biblical passages. She also championed the idea of private prayer, a concept that resonated with Protestant reformers who rejected the hierarchical structures of Catholicism that placed the clergy between the individual and God. Catherine's personal faith was not confined to the rituals of the Church. It was a deeply individual and intellectual practice that aligned with her broader commitment to religious reform. However, Catherine's advocacy for religious reform was not without its complications. The religious landscape in England was volatile, particularly during the reign of Henry VIII. Although Henry had broken from Rome, he had done so not out of doctrinal conviction but because of his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and Mary and Boleyn. As a result, the Church of England remained largely conservative in its practices, even as it rejected papal authority. Henry VIII was not a committed Protestant. He was a political pragmatist who maintained many Catholic doctrines in his new church, particularly those related to the sacraments and the authority of the clergy. This created a tension for Catherine, as she found herself in a court that was publicly committed to the Church of England, yet also steeped in Catholic traditions. As queen, Catherine was in a precarious position. She could not openly advocate for radical religious reforms without risking her position at court or even her life. England was a kingdom in which religious allegiance was a matter of state security, and anyone perceived as a threat to the religious order could be swiftly punished. For example, Catherine's predecessors, Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon, had both been victims of religious and political intrigue, their fates tied to the religious conflicts of the time. Catherine's position, therefore, required a delicate balancing act. She had to support Protestant ideas without alienating those at court who were still deeply loyal to Catholic traditions. Catherine also had to navigate her relationship with Henry VIII, whose religious policies were contradictory and unpredictable. While Henry had established the Church of England, he was not fully committed to Protestantism and still clung to many Catholic practices. For instance, Henry refused to allow the English Bible to be translated and widely distributed in the vernacular until later in his reign. As queen, Catherine had to balance her growing Protestant sympathies with her loyalty to her husband. She knew that her personal beliefs could never overshadow her role as the queen consort, a role that required her to support her husband and his policies, even when they were at odds with her own religious inclinations. This delicate balancing act became more difficult in the latter years of Henry's reign. As Henry's health deteriorated, his religious views became more extreme, and he became more intolerant of reformist ideas. In the face of Henry's increasingly authoritarian religious stance, Catherine had to be cautious in her advocacy for reform. She continued to support reformist theologians and scholars, but she did so in a way that would not provoke the king's ire. She was careful to avoid open confrontation with the conservative elements of the court, particularly those who were fiercely loyal to Catholicism. Despite these challenges, Catherine's advocacy for reform had a lasting impact. Her private religious beliefs and her support for reformist ideas helped to shape the religious landscape of England after Henry's death. Catherine's Protestant sympathies were a significant influence on the reigns of her stepchildren, particularly Edward VI, who would go on to establish Protestantism as the dominant religion in England. Moreover, her intellectual contributions to the religious debates of her time helped to lay the groundwork for the more radical reforms that would follow. Catherine Parr's religious beliefs and her role in the Reformation reveal a woman who was both intellectually curious and deeply committed to reform. Her journey from a Catholic upbringing to Protestant sympathies reflects the larger religious transformations taking place in England at the time. While she had to navigate the volatile religious environment at court with caution, her patronage of reformist scholars, her private devotion, and her advocacy for reform helped to shape the religious future of England. Her legacy as a queen who embraced the Reformation, not just politically but personally, places her among the most important figures in the history of the English Reformation. Catherine Parr's journey as queen consort of Henry VIII was marked not only by her political acumen but also by her strong religious convictions, which would bring her into direct conflict with the king's conservative Catholic views and the entrenched power structures at court. As Henry's final wife, Catherine was a queen who sought reform and found herself caught between the emerging Protestant movement and the prevailing Catholic doctrines supported by some of the most powerful figures in the court. This tension between personal belief and political survival led Catherine into dangerous theological debates, confrontations with powerful enemies, and a narrowly averted execution. It was a moment in history that could have ended tragically for her, but her survival was ultimately a result of her intelligence, her ability to navigate the court's political currents, and her capacity to submit strategically when necessary. The most significant danger Catherine faced came from her theological disagreements with Henry VIII, particularly as his health worsened and his authoritarian rule grew more oppressive. Despite the break from Rome and the establishment of the Church of England, Henry remained largely conservative in his religious views, keeping many traditional Catholic practices intact. He maintained the centrality of the sacraments and upheld the authority of the clergy, even as he had severed ties with the papacy. He had never fully embraced Protestant reforms, and over time, he became increasingly paranoid about what he saw as the threat posed by radical religious ideas. Catherine, on the other hand, had become a committed supporter of the reformist cause. She had developed a strong personal belief in the principles of Protestantism, influenced by her friendships with leading Protestant theologians and scholars, as well as her own religious studies. By the time she married Henry, Catherine was a key figure in the Protestant movement at court. However, the theological debates she engaged in with Henry were far from simple discussions of faith. They were high-stakes confrontations that had the potential to tear apart the royal marriage and cost her life. One of the most intense moments of tension between Catherine and Henry occurred when she engaged in theological debates with him in the privacy of their court. While the king was often somewhat tolerant of debates, especially on theological matters, Catherine's increasingly open support for Protestant reforms put her in direct opposition to Henry's own views. These debates were not just intellectual discussions. They were political confrontations that threatened to undermine Catherine's position as queen. In a time when religious loyalty was linked to political allegiance, these differences between Catherine and Henry could easily be seen as a challenge to the king's authority. Henry, who was known for his violent temper and absolute control over his court, had already executed 2 of his wives and was known to punish anyone who seemed to challenge his rule. The real danger for Catherine lay not only in her personal disagreements with Henry, but also in the political enemies she made at court as a result of her reformist views. Among the most dangerous figures in the court was Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who was a leading supporter of Catholic orthodoxy and a vehement opponent of the Protestant cause. Gardiner had already been involved in the downfall of Catherine's predecessor, Anne Boleyn, and had played a major role in the political campaigns against reformers. As a devout Catholic and a loyal supporter of the old religious order, Gardiner saw Catherine's sympathies for Protestantism as a direct threat to the stability of the monarchy and the Church. Gardiner was a man of considerable power at court, having served as Bishop of Winchester and holding significant influence over the religious and political landscape of England. His loyalty to the Catholic faith was uncompromising, and he had a long history of rooting out what he considered to be heresy. He viewed Catherine as a dangerous reformer, someone who was actively trying to subvert the religious order that had served England for centuries. Catherine, with her increasing influence over Henry and her patronage of reformist scholars, made her an obvious target for Gardiner's machinations. He saw an opportunity to eliminate her as a threat to the Catholic cause by accusing her of heresy and plotting against the Church. It was Gardiner's influence, coupled with the growing religious tensions in England, that led to one of the most dangerous moments in Catherine's life: the arrest warrant. Catherine, who had previously been secure in her position as Queen Consort, found herself the subject of accusations that she was a Protestant sympathizer who posed a threat to the king's reign and the stability of the Church of England. Her private theological discussions with reformers and her open support for Protestant ideas had made her a target. In 1546, the atmosphere at court had grown increasingly hostile toward her, and Gardiner, ever the opportunist, seized on this moment to accuse her of heresy. The arrest warrant was a terrifying moment in Catherine's life. Her marriage to Henry was still relatively new, and she was fully aware that challenging the king's religious views could cost her everything: her title, her life, and her legacy. Henry, ever suspicious of threats to his authority, had already executed 2 of his wives, and Catherine knew that she would not be exempt from his wrath. The arrest warrant marked a crucial turning point. For Catherine, survival was now a matter of political strategy, and she needed to act quickly to save herself. The charges of heresy, if proven, would lead to her execution, as had been the fate of Anne Boleyn, Catherine of Aragon, and others who had fallen out of favor. Despite the grave danger she faced, Catherine's survival came down to her ability to navigate the delicate politics of the court. As the wife of Henry VIII, Catherine had enjoyed a position of great influence, but she knew that her fate was ultimately in the hands of the king. In order to escape the charges and avoid a gruesome death, Catherine employed a strategy of submission. She understood that to survive, she needed to demonstrate her loyalty to Henry and his reign, particularly in matters of religion. She chose to publicly submit to the king's religious authority, even if it meant temporarily suppressing her own beliefs in order to save her life. Catherine's strategy was one of pragmatism. She did not attempt to deny her beliefs but instead expressed her sincere devotion to Henry and the Church of England, distancing herself from the Protestant reformers who had caused such tension in the court. She agreed to publicly renounce any heretical views and demonstrated her loyalty to Henry's leadership. She was keenly aware that her survival depended on keeping Henry's favor and avoiding any further theological confrontations. Her submission was not just to Henry's authority but also to the political realities of the time. She knew that any show of defiance could cost her everything. By submitting to Henry's demands and aligning herself more closely with the king's views, Catherine was able to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics and avoid execution. It was a decision that required great courage and self-awareness, but it ultimately preserved her life. Catherine's ability to adapt to the political environment and submit when necessary was a testament to her strength and resilience. She knew when to fight and when to yield, and it was this strategic submission that saved her life. Catherine's survival was a result of her intelligence, her ability to read the political landscape, and her willingness to make difficult compromises. While her religious beliefs remained important to her, she understood that in a world as volatile as the Tudor court, survival sometimes required sacrifice. Her escape from the arrest warrant and her eventual reconciliation with Henry marked a critical moment in her life, a moment that demonstrated not only her political savvy but also her strength in the face of enormous danger. Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, is often remembered for her resilience, political acumen, and influence at court. However, one of the most lasting and significant aspects of her legacy lies in her literary contributions. As the first English queen to publish works under her own name, Catherine Parr defied the conventions of her time and made a lasting impact on the intellectual and religious landscape of the Tudor period. Her writings, particularly Prayers or Meditations, 1545, and The Lamentation of a Sinner, published posthumously in 1547, not only provided a platform for her own religious and theological beliefs but also helped to shape the course of religious thought during the English Reformation. Catherine's literary career was remarkable for several reasons. During the Tudor period, women were generally discouraged from engaging in public intellectual or literary activities. It was rare for women, especially queens, to publish works under their own name, as it was seen as inappropriate for women to assert such visibility in the public sphere. Women's voices were often confined to the domestic or private realms, and they were expected to adhere to strict societal norms. In this context, Catherine's decision to publish her works was groundbreaking. Her writings not only expressed her personal religious beliefs but also served as a powerful statement about women's intellectual capabilities, making her an important figure in the development of women's literary voices in early modern England. The first of Catherine's major works was Prayers or Meditations, 1545, a collection of prayers and meditations written in English. This work was significant in several ways. First, it reflected Catherine's deep commitment to Protestantism, a belief that was considered controversial at court, especially given the volatile religious landscape of the time. By this point, the English Reformation had made significant strides under Henry VIII, but religious tensions remained high, with factions vying for control over the direction of the Church of England. Catherine, who had been an outspoken supporter of Protestant reform, used her position as queen to promote the reformist cause, and her prayers and meditations offered a personal reflection of her beliefs. The work was not merely a religious text, it was a deeply personal document that revealed Catherine's own struggles and spiritual journey. Prayers or Meditations was also notable for being one of the first works written by an English queen to be published under her own name. At the time, it was highly unusual for a woman to be involved in the public literary sphere, and even more rare for a queen to publish a book. Catherine's decision to put her name to her work was an act of defiance against the societal expectations of her time. It signaled that she was not just a passive figure in her marriage or her reign, but an active participant in the intellectual and religious debates that were reshaping England. Her publication also set a precedent for future generations of women writers who would look to her as a model of intellectual courage and independence. The content of Prayers or Meditations also reflected Catherine's religious journey. She had been raised in a Catholic household but had developed strong Protestant sympathies over the years, influenced by her exposure to leading reformist scholars and her personal study of the Bible. The prayers and meditations she included in the work were rooted in her own understanding of Scripture and Protestant theology. The work was not just a reflection of her faith, but also a tool for personal reflection and spiritual development. Catherine's emphasis on the importance of personal piety, Scripture, and prayer resonated with the broader Protestant movement, which was focused on individual relationships with God rather than the mediation of the clergy. Prayers or Meditations was well received at the time, and it reflected the religious and political currents of the era. However, it was not the only work that Catherine would publish. In 1547, 2 years after her death, another of her works was published posthumously, The Lamentation of a Sinner. This work, though less well known, was also significant for its theological content and its role in Catherine's literary legacy. The Lamentation of a Sinner was a deeply personal reflection on sin, repentance, and redemption, themes that were central to Protestant theology. The work was more introspective than Prayers or Meditations, focusing on the individual's relationship with God and the need for personal repentance. In this sense, it echoed the broader Protestant emphasis on the individual's direct access to God, bypassing the traditional Catholic reliance on the priesthood. Although The Lamentation of a Sinner was not as widely circulated during Catherine's lifetime, its publication after her death helped to solidify her legacy as a religious writer. It reinforced her role as a reformist voice and showed that her influence extended beyond her political and royal duties. The posthumous publication also underscored the enduring nature of her literary voice, even after her death in 1548. While the religious and political circumstances of the time were volatile, Catherine's works provided a stable foundation for the ongoing development of Protestant thought in England. One of the most important aspects of Catherine Parr's literary legacy is the way in which her writings influenced religious thought. At a time when religious beliefs were deeply intertwined with politics, Catherine's works provided a platform for the expression of reformist ideals. Her support for Protestantism, particularly the emphasis on personal scripture reading and private prayer, was in line with the broader Protestant movement in England, which sought to make religion more accessible to individuals and to break the monopoly of the Catholic Church. Catherine's works were a contribution to this shift in religious thought, and they helped to lay the groundwork for the more radical reforms that would follow after Henry VIII's death. Her writings also had a significant impact on the intellectual climate of the Tudor period. As Queen Consort, Catherine had access to a network of leading intellectuals, theologians, and reformers, and she used this network to further her religious beliefs. She was friends with figures like the reformist scholar John Cheek and the theologian Hugh Latimer, and she supported the work of Protestant reformers by encouraging the publication of their writings and by hosting discussions at court. Catherine's own works, particularly her meditations and prayers, became part of this intellectual exchange, contributing to the development of Protestant ideas in England. Her writings were not just religious tracts but also part of a broader conversation about the role of religion in society and the individual's relationship with God. Finally, the importance of Catherine Parr's literary voice in the Tudor period cannot be overstated. Her works offered a rare example of a queen who was not only politically influential but also intellectually active. In a time when women were often silenced or relegated to secondary roles, Catherine used her position as queen to assert her voice and to participate in the intellectual and religious debates of her time. By publishing under her own name, she set a precedent for other women in Tudor England, proving that women could be intellectual figures in their own right. Her works, though focused on religious themes, also spoke to larger issues of personal agency, intellectual independence, and the role of women in public life. Catherine's literary contributions remain a crucial part of her legacy. As the first English queen to publish works under her own name, she made a lasting impact on both religious thought and women's literary voices in early modern England. Her writings, deeply personal yet profoundly influential, helped to shape the course of the English Reformation and left an indelible mark on the intellectual history of the period. Through her works, Catherine Parr demonstrated that a woman could be both a queen and a thinker, a reformer and a writer, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond her time as the wife of Henry VIII. After the death of Henry VIII in 1547, Catherine Parr entered a new chapter of her life. As a widow, she was no longer the queen consort of England, but she still held a prominent place in the Tudor court as the Dowager Queen. Her position was a complicated one, both a widow and a powerful woman in a volatile political landscape. Catherine's transition from the regal position as queen to the status of widow presented challenges and opportunities alike, as she navigated her own financial security, the changes in her household, and her personal life. Yet, her period of widowhood was not to last long, as Catherine soon remarried, this time to Thomas Seymour, an affair that would have lasting consequences. Upon Henry's death, Catherine found herself in a somewhat secure position financially. As a widow, she held on to several of the lands and estates that had been granted to her during her marriage to Henry. This wealth provided her with a measure of independence and stability. As Dowager Queen, she also maintained an elevated status in the court, despite not holding the crown anymore. Her role as the widow of Henry VIII allowed her access to both the royal family and influential figures at court, but her life was about to take a drastic turn due to her remarriage. Catherine's financial security was significant. She had the right to control her own property, including various lands and estates that had been part of her dowry or granted to her during her marriage. This provided her with not just wealth but also a certain level of autonomy, as she was able to manage her affairs independently. Many noble widows found themselves dependent on their children or the goodwill of the crown, but Catherine, given her royal position and wealth, was in a fortunate situation. Moreover, as the Dowager Queen, she retained a degree of prestige and influence in the court, even though she was no longer married to the king. However, while her financial security was stable, Catherine's position was not without its challenges. As a widow, she faced the societal pressures and expectations that came with being a woman in the early Tudor period. Widows, especially those with royal connections, were expected to behave in a dignified and respectable manner, and Catherine had to navigate these expectations carefully. Her life, while more independent than most, still required her to act within the confines of court etiquette and to maintain decorum. Her personal life, too, underwent significant change following Henry's death. The court was no longer the same place it had been during her marriage to Henry VIII. With the king gone, Catherine was no longer at the center of royal power. The focus of the court had shifted to the young Edward VI, Henry's son, and the Regency Council that governed in his stead. Although Catherine held her title as Dowager Queen, she was no longer the most powerful woman in the kingdom, and this change had an impact on her role in the royal household. While Catherine's position as the widow of Henry VIII provided her with some freedom, she was still expected to act in accordance with the norms of her time. For a time, she focused on the education of her stepchildren, particularly Princess Elizabeth, who had been separated from her after her marriage to Henry. Elizabeth was now the second in line to the throne, and as a highly educated woman herself, Catherine took it upon herself to further the education of Elizabeth, especially in the realms of religion, language, and literature. Yet Catherine's time as a widow was not to be as uneventful as it may seem. As a woman of intelligence and ambition, Catherine was not content to remain alone for long. After several years, she turned to a new marriage, a marriage that would spark political intrigue and scandal, forever changing the trajectory of her life. Catherine's second marriage was to Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. At first, the relationship was kept secret, and it was only after their marriage in 1547 that the full details of their union came to light. Thomas Seymour was a man with grand ambitions, but he was also reckless, and his behavior would soon strain his relationship with Catherine as well as with her family. His desire for power and his reckless pursuit of his goals led to a turbulent marriage, one that would have long-lasting political consequences. At the time of their marriage, Thomas Seymour was already a prominent figure at court, holding the title of Baron Seymour of Sudeley. He had ambitions of advancing his own political career and securing a place of influence in the new order under Edward VI's reign. However, he was also known for his impulsive nature and his frequent disregard for caution and propriety. His attraction to Catherine was likely motivated by both personal desire and political ambition, as aligning himself with her, a widow of the former king, would have strengthened his position at court. Initially, the marriage between Catherine and Thomas Seymour appeared to be one based on mutual affection and companionship. Catherine, despite the scandalous nature of their secret courtship, was drawn to Thomas, as he was an ambitious, charismatic, and charming man. However, their marriage soon turned out to be far from a happy union. While Catherine may have believed she could provide stability and support for Thomas, his own reckless behavior began to strain the relationship. One of the most notable tensions in their marriage came from the impact Thomas's ambitions had on Catherine's relationship with her stepchildren, especially Princess Elizabeth. Thomas Seymour's flirtations with Elizabeth, which were seen as inappropriate and manipulative, caused a rift between Catherine and her stepdaughter. Elizabeth, still a young woman and a future queen, was vulnerable to the flirtations of a man who was actively seeking to climb the political ladder. Thomas's actions threatened to create a wedge between Catherine and Elizabeth, and Catherine's relationship with her stepchildren, particularly Elizabeth, would never fully recover from the tension caused by Thomas's behavior. Politically, the marriage to Thomas Seymour had significant consequences. While Catherine Parr was already a widow, remarriage to a man of Seymour's status opened the door for political maneuvering that could disrupt the delicate balance of power at court. Thomas Seymour, as the brother of the Queen consort, saw an opportunity to further his own ambitions. He had been politically sidelined under Henry VIII, but had a clear desire to attain greater power. His marriage to Catherine was not just a personal union, but a political alliance that sought to place him closer to the throne. His bold ambitions would lead to several attempts to gain political control, but his reckless behavior ultimately backfired. Seymour's ambition was not limited to his personal relationships with women. He became involved in plotting and scheming to position himself as a more powerful figure at court. His desire for power often led him to act impulsively, disregarding the consequences of his actions. This reckless behavior eventually led to his downfall, as his actions were deemed too destabilizing for the court. In the end, His ambitions resulted in his arrest and execution for treason, leaving Catherine a widow once again. The political consequences of Catherine's marriage to Thomas Seymour were long-lasting. While she may have initially hoped for a supportive and companionable marriage, the union quickly became embroiled in political intrigue and personal scandal. The strain on Catherine's relationship with Elizabeth and the broader political consequences of Seymour's reckless ambition ultimately tarnished the legacy of Catherine's second marriage. Catherine Parr's marriage to Thomas Seymour was an unfortunate chapter in an otherwise remarkable life. It revealed the complex dynamics of court life in Tudor England, where ambition, power, and personal relationships were often intertwined. Despite her misfortune in her second marriage, Catherine Parr remained a resilient and influential figure in her time. Her ability to survive, even after the death of her second husband, was a testament to her strength and determination. In the final months of Catherine Parr's life, she experienced both joy and tragedy. Despite the trials she had endured throughout her life, from multiple marriages to political intrigue, Catherine's later years seemed to promise the happiness she had long sought. At nearly 35 years old, Catherine became pregnant once more, a remarkable event given the advanced age for a woman to carry a child in the 16th century. Her marriage to Thomas Seymour, her second husband after Henry VIII's death, seemed to offer a new chapter, and the possibility of motherhood was one she embraced eagerly. Catherine's pregnancy, however, would ultimately lead to her untimely death. She gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, in August 1548. The birth was difficult, and the complications that followed were significant. Catherine, in the aftermath of childbirth, contracted puerperal fever, a deadly infection that was common during that time for women after giving birth. It was a tragic fate, and Catherine, despite her intelligence, resilience, and years of survival through tumultuous marriages and political upheaval, could not survive the ravages of this common yet often fatal illness. The death of Catherine Parr on September 5, 1548, was deeply felt by those closest to her. She had lived through much in her 36 years, surviving the complexities of Henry VIII's court, navigating the treacherous waters of religion and politics, and becoming the first English queen to publish under her own name. Her death marked the end of an era. For Thomas Seymour, her passing was a blow, leaving him with his infant daughter, Mary Seymour, who would eventually be lost to history in a largely forgotten life. Elizabeth I, who had been both influenced and shaped by Catherine, also felt the loss of her stepmother, who had helped to guide her during her formative years. For Elizabeth, Catherine's death was a turning point. Despite the tensions that had existed between the two women, particularly due to the behavior of Thomas Seymour, Elizabeth's loss of Catherine was significant. Catherine had been a mother figure to Elizabeth during her early years in the court of Henry VIII. The education and religious outlook that Catherine imparted had a lasting impact on Elizabeth's reign and views on queenship. Elizabeth would later reflect on Catherine's role in shaping her ideas about ruling, women's education, and the religious reforms that had characterized her stepmother's life. Catherine's death left a gap not just in her immediate family but also in the political and religious landscape of England. While she may have lived a life that seemed to be one of survival, her death highlighted the frailty of life in Tudor England, especially for women. It was a reminder of the challenges women faced during the period, where childbirth was both a blessing and a potential death sentence. The death of Catherine Parr, so soon after the birth of her daughter, was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of even the most resilient of women. The political fallout from her death was also notable. Thomas Seymour's life continued to unravel after her death. His own ambitions, now unrestrained by Catherine's presence, led to his involvement in dangerous plots, which eventually resulted in his arrest and execution. The political turbulence surrounding Seymour's downfall underscored the precarious nature of power in Tudor England. After Catherine's death, the focus returned to the young Edward VI, and the turmoil of the Seymour family served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. Despite the tragedy of her death, Catherine Parr's legacy lived on. She had shaped not only the future of her family but also the broader course of English history, particularly through her contributions to religious reform, her role as an early female author, and her influence on Elizabeth I's reign. Catherine Parr was not merely a wife or a queen. She was a woman who actively contributed to the political, religious, and cultural landscape of her time. One of Catherine Parr's most significant contributions to England was her role in religious reform. As a queen consort, she aligned herself with the Protestant faction of the English court, advocating for reform and supporting the spread of Protestant ideas. While she did not have the same political power as Henry VIII or Edward VI, her position as queen consort allowed her to promote religious ideas and reforms in a way that few women could. Her influence on the religious direction of England was subtle but significant. She helped to steer England further away from Catholicism, providing support for the reformers and working to maintain Protestant ideologies within the royal court. Her role in religious reform extended beyond her political influence. Catherine Parr was also an intellectual force in her own right. She was a learned woman who engaged in theological debates and wrote extensively on religious matters. Her works, including Prayers or Meditations and The Lamentation of a Sinner, became important texts in the development of Protestant thought in England. These writings, published in the years following her death, had a lasting impact on the religious landscape of the country, providing a voice for women in theological debates. She was the first English queen to publish under her own name, a notable achievement that helped to pave the way for other women to contribute to the intellectual and literary life of the nation. Her literary contributions also extended to her personal prayers and meditations, which reflect her deep spirituality and commitment to the reformist ideals of the time. These works helped to shape the way that women in the Tudor period were able to engage with religious and philosophical thought. They provided an example of how women could contribute to the intellectual and spiritual life of their society, despite the limitations placed on them by the patriarchal structure of the time. Catherine Parr's writings continue to be studied and appreciated for their theological depth and their pioneering role in women's intellectual history. Catherine Parr's influence on the reign of Elizabeth I cannot be understated. While Elizabeth and Catherine may have had their differences, particularly due to the strained relationship caused by Thomas Seymour's actions, Catherine's influence on Elizabeth as a ruler was profound. As a stepmother, Catherine provided Elizabeth with a model of strong, independent queenship. Her commitment to education, her engagement with theological debates, and her ability to navigate the complex politics of the Tudor court were qualities that Elizabeth later embraced. Catherine's example showed Elizabeth that women could rule effectively, even in a world dominated by men. She had a quiet yet substantial influence on Elizabeth's understanding of power, governance, and religion. In addition to her direct influence on Elizabeth, Catherine Parr's legacy has been reassessed in modern times. Historians have come to recognize Catherine not just as a survivor of Henry VIII's tumultuous reign, but as a woman who shaped the course of history. Her role in religious reform, her contributions to intellectual and literary life, and her influence on the future Queen of England have made her a key figure in the Tudor period. Today, she is recognized not just as a queen consort but as a powerful and influential woman in her own right. Catherine Parr's legacy, therefore, is multifaceted. While her life may have been marked by the challenges of multiple marriages and the dangers of political intrigue, her contributions to England were far-reaching. Her role in religious reform, her literary works, and her influence on Elizabeth I all helped to shape the course of English history. Catherine Parr may have died young, but her legacy lives on, not just as the last wife of Henry VIII, but as a woman who shaped the future of England in ways that are still felt today. Catherine Parr's life journey was one marked by both personal and political complexities, as well as by her remarkable ability to navigate the treacherous world of the Tudor court. Her story is one of survival, resilience, and intelligence, yet also of compassion, dedication, and the pursuit of a greater good. Born into a noble family, Catherine was exposed early to the intricacies of court life and political maneuvering, skills she would later employ throughout her life as queen, regent, and intellectual. Her life was shaped by several pivotal moments, from her early widowhoods and subsequent marriages to her time as the sixth wife of Henry VIII, and then as the mother of Mary Seymour. She was a woman who not only lived through turbulent times but also helped to shape the course of history. One of the most striking aspects of Catherine's life was her resilience. Despite the many personal and political challenges she faced, including multiple marriages, the political maneuvering of her time, and the religious upheavals of the period, she showed an incredible ability to adapt and survive. Catherine was not only a survivor of Henry VIII's notorious reign, but she also demonstrated strength in the face of personal adversity, especially as a widow twice before becoming the queen consort. The manner in which she overcame these challenges speaks to her inner fortitude. She didn't simply endure, she learned, adapted, and thrived in the face of adversity. Her intelligence was equally apparent. Catherine was unusually well educated for a woman of her time, a factor that would serve her well throughout her life. She was not merely a passive figure in the Tudor court but an active participant, especially in the religious and intellectual discourses of her time. Catherine was an avid reader and thinker, engaging deeply with religious texts and philosophies. She was the first English queen to publish under her own name, an extraordinary achievement, and her writings, including prayers or meditations and the Lamentation of a Sinner, provided important insights into her personal faith and her support for the Protestant Reformation. Her ability to write and publish such works was a testament to her intellect and her willingness to challenge the constraints placed on women in her era. In addition to her intelligence, Catherine was a woman of great compassion. She showed a great deal of care and concern for others, particularly in her role as stepmother to Henry VIII's children. Despite the difficult relationship dynamics at court, especially with the volatile figures of Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, Catherine worked tirelessly to support their education, advocate for their rights, and try to ensure that they had a harmonious relationship with each other and with the court. Her involvement in their lives helped to shape their futures, particularly that of Elizabeth I, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. Catherine's concern for the future of these children was not only maternal but also political, as she understood the importance of fostering a stable succession to the throne. Her compassion extended to the people she encountered, both at court and in her own personal life, as she consistently worked toward reconciliation and peace in the volatile Tudor court. Catherine Parr's life also provides a model for queenship. Unlike many of her predecessors, Catherine was not merely a figurehead. She was actively engaged in the political and intellectual life of the kingdom. Her role as regent for a time, during Henry VIII's campaign in France, demonstrated her capability and political acumen. She was not only able to manage the royal household and the governance of England during Henry's absence, but also had the foresight to navigate complex political situations with both grace and authority. This ability to rule, combined with her commitment to her own religious beliefs and her influence on the course of English religious reform, makes Catherine an important figure in the history of English queenship. She was not just a wife but a queen in her own right, demonstrating strength, intelligence, and leadership in an era when such qualities were often underappreciated in women. In many ways, Catherine Parr's life was also a precursor to the reign of Elizabeth I. As stepmother to Elizabeth, Catherine served as both a maternal figure and an intellectual mentor, and her influence can be seen in Elizabeth's later views on queenship and governance. Catherine's own example of strong, intelligent, and independent leadership would leave a lasting impression on Elizabeth. Her religious reformist views, particularly in relation to the Protestant Reformation, also resonated with Elizabeth, whose reign would solidify Protestantism as England's official religion. The way Catherine navigated the religious turbulence of her time helped lay the groundwork for Elizabeth to confidently step into her own leadership role in a post-Reformation England. Ultimately, Catherine Parr's place in history is secure not just because of her position as the last wife of Henry VIII, but because of the broader and more significant contributions she made during her lifetime. She was more than just a queen. She was a reformer, a writer, a political figure, and a woman who demonstrated resilience in the face of extreme challenges. Her intellectual contributions, her role in shaping the future of her stepchildren, and her impact on religious reform all helped to solidify her place as a significant figure in Tudor history. Her legacy is not one of mere survival in a tumultuous court, but one of active influence and change. Catherine's contributions to the Protestant Reformation in England are often overshadowed by the more prominent figures of her time, such as Thomas Cranmer or Henry VIII himself, but her role was nonetheless important. By supporting the reformist movement within the court, promoting the education and advancement of Protestant ideas, and even publishing her religious meditations, Catherine was an integral part of the transformation of England's religious landscape. She was a woman of strong faith and conviction, and her writings stand as a testament to her belief in the importance of personal devotion and the role of women in theological discussions. Catherine Parr's life was multifaceted, marked by strength, intelligence, resilience, and compassion. Her legacy goes beyond her role as Henry VIII's last wife, positioning her as a model for queenship and leadership in an era where women were often relegated to secondary roles. She was a woman ahead of her time, contributing not only to the religious and intellectual movements of her day, but also to the development of a vision of queenship that would later influence her stepdaughter, Elizabeth I. Her life demonstrates that, far from being merely a passive player in the Tudor court, Catherine Parr was an active and determined figure whose impact continues to be felt in the history of England.